My name's Richard Brock. I'm an independent filmmaker, was with the Natural History Unit for 35 years, worked on Life on Earth and Living Planet with David Attenborough, and now do my own films almost entirely about conservation. Well, I suppose it was way back to school days when I was bird watching and catching butterflies as you did then. Television, probably, to some extent, whatever it was at that time. So it really just grew up with me, and then I went around the world filming on various series for the BBC. So it just grew from that, and I got more and more interested in conservation from what I saw, and that's why I'm trying to do something about it in my own way. Well, I applied to the BBC in Bristol, which was very small then. I was probably only 50 people, if that. And I was eventually taken on as a general assistant, which I think means dog's body. And I started in radio with someone called Tony Soper. We made a film about geese up in Scotland. And then I went into television in a small way with Look, with Sir Peter Scott, and the famous Heinz Seelman woodpecker film, which was, I didn't used to call it the water cooler moment, but people talked about the fact that you could see inside a woodpecker's nest. Now, these days you'd see inside every nest that exists, but at that time it shattered people. I mean, they were so excited by that, and Heinz Seelman was a star, and of course he went on to make other excellent films, but they never had the impact of that first one, because it was like seeing into a secret. I did work on that series called Look for a long time, and they had a studio show, of course now would look very, very old-fashioned, where Peter Scott interviewed various people. Sometimes they had animals in the studio, and then David Attenborough came on the scene. He did Zoo Quest, and he usually had animals in the studio which bit him or escaped, and that was good value. So I remember him when he looked even younger than he was then. I really love radio, and they do more conservation on radio than they do explicitly, at least, on television now. I think they've done several series about conservation. Usually it's on a Tuesday morning, about 11 o'clock, and I used to watch those. They took really good stories, obviously very well researched, and there was like 12 in a row, and I think they're now doing something at the same slot, which is about nature and people and conservation. So they keep going at that, which is really important. I'm not sure in terms of the politics whether that's true. I think the BBC has to be careful. So whether it's on radio or television probably doesn't make that much difference. Obviously there are images that you could show on television which would show more, say more, than something less visible on radio. But I think the discussions and the interviews on radio are so important that really if you watch or listen to both, then you get a really good cross-section of what's going on. Well, in terms of budgets and things like that, I mean, you just had to have an idea, and you'd go to someone with the idea and say, you want to do a film about tawny owls or woodpeckers, and they'd say, oh, that sounds interesting, off you go. There was some talk about, well, how much might it cost, but there wasn't much control on it, shall we say, which was great. If you were free to go on your own or with a crew and just film the things you really wanted to show, then that was perfect, really. And I really made the most of that, I think. But it's usually driven by some idea or story or animal that you really wanted to show, and that was a great privilege to be able to do that. I'm not saying you couldn't do it now, but you'd have to go through various development departments and committees. I don't know, all sorts of people would have to check it. Certainly the money would be looked at, which is fair enough. It's public money. But no, the old days it was very free and easy, I would say, and a very appreciative audience, because a lot of things hadn't been seen then. I mean, these days, I think the problem is that almost anything you want to show has been seen somehow before. I mean, I think, big new series, there's one called One Planet, there's another one called Our Planet. These are two landmark series, to use a well-worn phrase. Now, they claim this is going to raise the bar. Well, I can't believe the bar can go any higher, and they're going to hit the bar, because I can't think of anywhere which is an unknown place, a major landscape with very rare animals that to some extent hasn't been seen. I mean, I challenge them to show that, and I look forward to it. And they've got massive budgets, they've got 5 years, and maybe they will do that. But as soon as you say Amazon or Sahara Desert, maybe somewhere in China, but then there have been series made in China. Australia's been done, whole series have been done in Indonesia, obviously America. I mean, I look forward to seeing what they can do by raising the bar. It's a challenge now. So in the old days, you didn't have that. If you went and showed a few lemurs in Madagascar with David running around, terrific. You now, I think there's probably a program on Madagascar every few months. And those programs sometimes don't tell the truth, because they show all these lovely animals in Madagascar. Well, when I did a film in Madagascar, what I wanted to show was that only like 10% of it was like that. The rest had been trashed. Oh no, we can't have that, that's bad news. But it's the truth. Well, I suppose the record shows that life on Earth must have been that. I mean, apparently seen by 500 million people. Well, how you count 500 million people, I don't know. But some of those obviously were young people, university types perhaps, and I believe that these programs were shown on university syllabuses, if that's a word. So hopefully that did influence people, and that was a long time ago. It was like 25, 30 years ago. So since that time, through all the other landmark series, that's probably had the most impact. It had the advantage too, of course, of having animals that no one had seen before, because we did have a good budget. We did have David Attenborough, very much behind us, and I think that's the series he's most proud of. So, I mean, I don't think you can beat that. I'm not putting down the people who are going to raise the bar, but I think it's a tough one to do that. And I look forward to it, and I just really hope there's some conservation in it. I don't think you can really now go put a program out which is, if you like, pure wilderness. I think the audience is thinking, well, it can't really be like that, can it? There's got to be some snag, and then of course you get accused of saying it's all gloom and doom. Well, it's not all gloom and doom. There's a lot of positive stuff that could be looked at, I think. I think it was one of Attenborough's things he always wanted to do. I mean, he's always maintained it's the greatest show on Earth, greatest show on the planet, the story of life. And in a way, ever since that series, which was filmed with new equipment, had really good people working on it, you couldn't beat it. I mean, you could do Living Planet, which I also did. You could do Trials of Life. You did The Private Life of Plants. And interestingly with Attenborough, because Attenborough was the driving force, of course, behind all this, was I think he always wanted to have the word life in the titles. And I remember way back when we wanted to do Living Planet, we said, well, David, what we'd like to do is call it Planet Earth, which of course was done subsequently. And he was very polite, and he kind of shrugged it off and slid round it. And he said, no, I think we'll call it The Living Planet. And since then, planet's always been in there, in nearly all of them, I think. Life has always been in there. So you had, the life of birds and the life of mammals, and it went on and on and on. That's a tough one, because there are a lot of them. I suppose the program that intrigued me most, and this goes back to new things to see, and I don't think there's been much on frogs and toads and amphibians that much since, because people aren't that interested, even though Kermit is one of the most successful frogs in town. But I think being able to meet some of these people who were so fascinated by these animals, and there's a frog from Chile, that broods the tadpoles, or frogs rather, little frogs in its mouth. This is the male, so he's singing, then he's pregnant, so he stops singing, and then out come some baby frogs. And the guy waited 180 hours for this to happen, and he got the shot. So, I mean, that was just one example. And the nice thing about working with something like frogs or bats, which I also worked on, is there are these really, shall we say, obscure scientists who are sort of fanatical about their animal, and they welcome you and they say, gosh, yeah, we could do this. And if you give them some money, obviously you'd like to help them with their research. And so they'll help you. On the other hand, more recently, what happens, if you've got a very popular group like chimpanzees or lions or something, and these chaps have been working on it for 10 years, what they don't want to see is a crew coming in for a week, filming what they discovered, and then going home and paying them, a bit of money. So I think there's a real difference, and I really like working with these guys. I mean, some were quite eccentric. I mean, if you went to a bat conference, I mean, they weren't exactly hanging from the ceiling, but I mean, they were they were different. And the frog guys, quite often quite cold-blooded and strange, but so determined to help you and make a good show on frogs. So I think, to answer your question, the program that interested me most, included the particular species that interested me most, was the one on frogs. Well, I'd done my time, I think. I had 25 years, and I'd done the big series. I'd done one-offs like Natural World. I was involved with that from the start. That was wonderful. I suppose in the end, I don't think the BBC was, as a whole, if you include the channel controllers and the commissioners and the development people, they were not really prepared to support conservation. I mean, certainly not up front. I mean, they would hide it. And, well, you probably know the story, that the Blue Planet, the one about conservation, which was called Deep Trouble, was not shown on BBC One in this country. It was hidden, in my view, on BBC Two, because they didn't want to show it. And in the States, when it was shown in the States, they didn't even show the last programme. And there was some big conference, and someone went up to a millionaire and said, we'd like some money for the oceans. And this guy said, well, I've just seen Blue Planet. There's nothing wrong with the oceans. So actually, that was it was devaluing the oceans. And I think the BBC is to blame for that, because if any corporation, any large organisation hasn't got the guts to take a chance. I mean, it's the last programme. If they put it on BBC One, all right, if it got a less of an audience, well, okay, they could say, well, we tried. And some, obviously, a lot of people would have watched it. I think the trick, and I think you probably agree with me, is to try and blend a message, let's call it a message. Don't preach, but put an intriguing message through a very well-made blue-chip movie. And, there are ways of doing that. I think the Batman film in Mexico, with that very good scientist who was a Mexican, you wouldn't really expect that, working with agaves as a plant, and bats that fed on the flowers of the plant, and tequila. Now, if you had to find a mix, a winning mix, in my view, that was it. And I'm sure there are others like that. But personally, that's what I'm always hunting for. It's called Batman. I think it was called Batman, and it was a nice title, actually. And this guy was so committed. I think these characters, they're so important. I mean, all right, you have a language problem, subtitles maybe, showing it around the world, whatever distribution problems you might have. But I think it overrode those, really, with this amazing mixture. So that's what I would be looking for personally. And it was quite positive. I mean, that's another thing one could talk about, is how negative or how positive some of this stuff is these days. I think it's better than it was. No, I don't think so, because the pressure wasn't on that at that time. I mean, I don't think climate change was ever said. I don't think it was out there at all. I seem to remember that Sir Peter Scott, who was like the godfather of grandfather of conservation, he was a sort of silent, he was a single voice out there. And it was at the point where all people knew about wild species were like children's books. You know, tigers live in Africa, tigers live in India, lions live in Africa, kangaroos live in Australia. You know, that was it. I mean, and they're okay out there. That's all we knew. It was like tradition. And then gradually, you know, people became aware that there was problems for some of these animals, and then of course it broadened to where they lived, and eventually broadened right out to the planet, which is what we've got now. So I suppose you could argue it actually it's changed quite a lot in quite a short time. But there's been a delay in some cases that people just didn't want to see it. You know, they didn't want bad news. You come back from the office, you don't want to be told the world is about to end. You say, put the telly on, there's probably something funny. Well, I suppose if you continue the problem that I had when I left, that the BBC wasn't doing enough on conservation for whatever reason, and I thought to myself, well, look, I can maybe help, particularly with the social media, which I don't understand, but I have a lot of younger, helpful people who do help me, and I could see the way that was reaching people. So to depend just on television, although there are a lot of channels on television, and probably I would think about, if you look at all the channels that can show wildlife, there's probably about 10 actually. So channels like Watch, Yesterday, Eden, National Geographic, Animal Planet, Nat Geo. Now some of those are trash, some of those are Shark Fang TV, which I dislike, put it mildly. But I felt that more could be done with a bit of skill in the storytelling, and so with this idea I had of winners and losers, I was looking at 30 different subjects and trying to assess how to turn losers into winners. So the intention was positive. Now that doesn't mean there aren't lots of losers. I mean, there are lots of losers if you go around the planet, I'm afraid. You know, there are lots of losers, but some of them have been turned into winners. And what I tried to do was take interesting stories, which, as I said before, include people, individual scientists maybe, and an interesting animal in a way that you wouldn't expect. So each one is probably about some issue. It's hidden in the film, behind, if you like, some scientist or person or animal. So, for example, the one on fulmars, which is a seabird, a beautiful seabird, is suffering from eating plastics. And its numbers grew when the fishing business increased and a lot of trash fish was chucked out of boats. So the fulmars did well, and now they've gone down because they're eating plastic. So the film actually starts in somebody's house where they're using plastic in some way, and they flush a plastic item down the loo or down the sink, all right? So you choose your item. Anyway, it goes down the tube, goes down the tube, it goes into darkness, goes out of the fulmar's beak, right? You're still with me? With a wet wipe, whatever, condom, whatever, ends up in the chick. So the opening sequence is 1 minute. You relate to that because that's what you do. but the opening minute is tracking through pipes which turn into the throat of a baby fulmar, and that's going to kill it. And indeed, it's going to kill the adult. So then you start looking at, well, what happened to this? It's a detective story. Why have these birds come up and then gone down? And of course, they're beautiful to look at. So you may need a scientist, you may need a fisherman, you certainly need someone in the house using plastic. So I mean, that's just one example of trying to mix an interesting lot of ingredients that you wouldn't expect, because surprise, particularly, in these kind of films, is so important. So I have about 7 ingredients that each program would include, including sex and comedy, right? That's the idea. We're doing one on the Beach Boys. It's called the Beach Boys. It's about ghost crabs in Kenya. It's a very well-studied animal, you probably know. It lives underground in tunnels. And we've got the music, obviously, if we can clear it, Beach Boys music. So it's a crab's eye view living on a beach at Watamu in Kenya. And they've got these amazing eyes on stalks, you probably know. So we certainly have a camera underground in the burrows. We might even have a tiny, tiny camera on its head behind its eyes. And that's for the kids who live along there. That's for the children. So hopefully they're going to laugh at this. So, it's just another mix that might work. Well, what I do, because I'm stupid, so I ask people to do this for me. So I have a website, and the stuff goes on YouTube. What I do, most of these films are like between 20 and 30 minutes. They're quite fast moving. They're all a surprising mix, that's what I would try to say, and there's 30 of them, right? So we will have 30 by the end of the year. We're just coming up to about 15 at the moment. I mean, the first one we really finished because we wanted to get it out quite soon was about whaling. It's called Are Whales Winning? And it's quite political. It looked at, obviously, the whaling industry, which is quite corrupt and still in the balance, whether the Japanese will go down again next season. They said they may go down. So, and there's a remarkable, slightly crazy guy called Captain Paul Watson, probably know Sea Shepherd, very dramatic. But it also combined the whole question of whales in captivity and the effect on SeaWorld. So that was a case of taking on or exposing what was already being exposed, which was the cruelty to animals. And 2 trainers have been killed at SeaWorld, which is run by a beer company. And so, that for me, when I see these ideas and I see that combination of elements, plus great shots of whales, hopefully. The other thing that was to my advantage is because I started making some of these films like 10 or 15 years ago, well, nowadays, HD is taken over from standard definition, SD. So I appreciate that. I like to think that if the story's good enough, it doesn't actually matter too much. People will watch it. But actually, I can use it to my advantage by we have a logo, W and L, winners and losers. And with that, we put the date on the screen. So we actually use the older material as part of the story of the film. So it's actually about change, because all these things are changing. I mean, we did one called Is Dubai Doomed?, which is about the state of a very greedy country, and we sent it to Dubai. And as each big meeting comes up, and the next big one's in Paris, we update that Dubai film. So when people see it, hopefully they'll say, God, that was last week. So we've got the structure of it. And in some cases, as I said, these films have already been assembled. I mean, I took a chance, assembled them in the past, and there they are sitting upstairs. And I think, I could use that. I could update that, put some new stuff in, and it'll make a new story at half an hour. So that applies to, say, 30 of these films. And they're all about different issues. They're all about different kinds of animals. So they're not all birds or something. We've got several on fish. Frogs we got, whales obviously, just a whole range of them. There are certain species, and Wildscreen had this arrangement, didn't they, where you had an endangered species and they kept that for those particular species in case someone wanted to show it later. And actually the golden toad of Costa Rica, which died out for no apparent reason, was in Life on Earth. So that was a species that is in the archive and should be. If you broaden it to environments or habitats, that is more difficult. And again, there may be some losers there. You could go back to a place which had forest and is now quite likely has been chopped down and is a desert. On the other hand, you could go the other way and you could go back to places which have now been replanted or flooded when it was drained before. So I think you could go both ways. I think there's a time value in that, a historical value, an archive value in that. Whether it's worth, and I don't know if I mean money here, but I don't know if it's worth the money and the personnel to do this, because if it's not done and isn't accessible, then you might as well give up. I mean, you've got to do it, haven't you, so that people can reach it. And that is going to be the question, whether there is a big fund, whether the BBC and its benevolence feels it can do that. I mean, you could argue the same about all sorts of other subjects, not just natural history. So I really don't know the answer to that. I mean, I would, the fact that Life on Earth exists as separate programs, at least that's, as far as I know, that's still there. If you're talking about what we used to call the offcuts or the rushes or whatever it was, I'm not sure they're still held. And you'd need someone to go through and say, well, this bit is useful, this bit is useful, and probably those bits probably amount to, like, I'm guessing 10% of what's still in the archive. So somebody's going to make that decision and chuck out the 90%, I suppose, put it in a skip. I have to say that the current against the planet is inexorable. I mean, human numbers. I mean, sex is fun. People like having children. That is absolutely basic. Climate change, obviously, has become, it's climate change fatigue we have. People actually don't want to know about that. I think what I felt, the reason I did Dubai was, Dubai seems to me the worst example of excess on the planet. I mean, the greed, the consumerism, the pollution, just no thought for the future. But a lot of people would aspire to that. You can't really blame them when someone in another country sees these cars and these big shops and these malls. When sea level rises in Dubai, as they say it will, I mean, what about those islands they built at huge cost? If you were a footballer and you built this villa or had this bought or rented this villa on one of those islands, one of the Palm Islands, you're buggered. You're going to be flooded. Now, Dubai doesn't have a setup which at the moment seems to restrain that. It's run by this ruling family, and they just see everything getting better forevermore, and it can't be. It's not sustainable. A magic word. It's not sustainable. So I think, the number of people and what they need, the resources that they need, or led to believe that they need. It's easy for us to sit here, in the sunshine with everything we want in a way. But you think of the desperately poor people, the migrants and so on. I mean, I don't see a way out of that.